could do it with Hannah. Not the other two. So take her up on it. Take her up on it. All right, Beth Messiah is on. What's this? You're live. You caught me on my watch. All right. It says Facebook is live. All right, thank you for joining us. This is the second installation of Messianic history. Last week we looked at the book of Acts, and we saw this progression of how effective the message of Yeshua was in the first century. I had mentioned, I believe, Professor Jacob Yoch from Canada when he was alive, and his great work, the Jewish people and Jesus Christ. I think it's in the first century, but he estimated 100,000 Jewish people coming to the faith in Yeshua the Messiah in the first century. It's a lot of people. When you think about 5,000 Sadducees, 5,000 Pharisees, and 10,000 Essenes, 100,000 is an enormous number. No wonder the leaders of Jerusalem said that they're going to take over the whole world. You know, I mean, that was hyperbole, but this was a serious contender for taking over the faith of the Jewish people. So, first century, we see this incredible grassroots movement that is forwarded by the apostles, the shlichim, those sent out translocally to effect the message of the Messiah having come, his atonement, his resurrection, and the power of the Ruach HaKodesh, the power of the Holy Spirit, demonstrated in the lives of the believers as they went along their daily routine, as the apostles went establishing congregations all over the place. And we saw last week that basically the setup was the synagogal model and mentality. And now, where are we? We are at a place where 70 CE comes into play. And 70 CE, some say 72, let's just say 70 for a round number. 70 CE is the end of the first Jewish revolt of the of that era, of the new era after Yeshua, and the second one was in 135. But in 70 CE, Rome managed to take hold of Jerusalem. They broke the siege of Jerusalem through some traitors and through the civil war, which one of these days we ought to go into. That's an interesting history, that there was civil war within the religious sects, and a large amount of people fighting against, well, Jews fighting against Jews. And it so weakened and crippled Israel that the Romans were easily in an advantage, and they won that, they stopped the revolt. Now, as a function of that revolt especially, there was a surge of attacks on the line of David. Why do you think? Right, but if there's no king, if there's no candidate for king, you can't revolt again, right? So they attacked the lineage of David. Anybody that was of the lineage of David that was eligible as far removed, as possible even, to eliminate the seed of David. And they were highly successful. But as a function of that, what ensued was what? The lineage of Yeshua. In other words, it was James who was in charge of the Jerusalem congregation, and as a function of James, other relatives, more distant in each generation, were the leadership of the congregation in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, despite the growth of congregations throughout the known world, Rome, Greece, Mesopotamia, and Africa. Jerusalem was always looked to. You can see that very clearly in Acts, that the collections that were made were always for Jerusalem. And so an apostle, somebody in charge, would come to a particular city, and they would make a donation for Jerusalem, for the poor in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was slowly being decimated by the Romans. And in 70 CE, that was even more of the fact, since the temple was razed, and Jews were not allowed to even worship there again. So, yes. So the temple being destroyed, then year after year after year, the lineage of David is being eliminated, and the lineage of David are called the Desposinoi. The Desposinoi are those people who are in charge of Jerusalem, literally, in a sense, the spiritual head, although it was not the episcopal model. It was the Zechariah model, the elders of the synagogue and temple model. They were still looked to, these leaders, lineage of Yeshua, they were looked at as the spiritual head, if you will. So the last of the Desposinoi end in 110. There are no more relatives, despite the Da Vinci Code, right? There are no more relatives of Yeshua left. And so what happened was you got kind of a weakened leadership where yearly from 110 to 113, the leadership in Jerusalem was rotated year to year. Well, when you get that kind of rotation, you lose connection with an individual who has longevity and experience. And so other centers where people have longevity, like Antioch, like Alexandria, like Rome, like the various cities, the 7 cities in modern Turkey, and westward Ho as well. We are pretty sure that Paul was successful in his western campaign. I know there's a tradition that he never got to it, never got to Spain, but the patristic fathers say he did. He succeeded. He got the monies that he needed primarily from Rome to move west, so the good news had spread throughout what was then the known world, basically. But you have the cities where there's, for example, in Galatia, cities of Galatia, oftentimes there was a majority of Jewish people and a minority of Gentiles, whereas in Rome you have a majority of Gentiles and a minority of Jews. And where there's a majority of Jews, the temptation is to make everybody Jewish. And where there's a majority of Gentiles, there's a resistance, because they've got their own tradition, they've got their own culture, and so forth and so on. There's a resistance. Why should we listen to this minority telling us what to do? We can transpose a lot of the things that are already ingrained in Greco-Roman society, and we kind of can transform them. Just an example, the resurrection of Yeshua is an important issue. It's an important issue because it gives power to the blood, the eternal blood of the Messiah. So the blood of the Messiah, Hebrews says, continually cleanses us. So that resurrection becomes important for the resurrection of Israel, right? The promise of Israel being resurrected from the dead, and the promise of the world being resurrected from the dead. Is that clear? Okay? That's a Jewish view, but a biblical view of resurrection, right? It's not just bringing, well, it is. It's bringing Israel back to life. It's bringing the world, the cosmos, really back to life. But in the Greco-Roman world, as there started to be non-Jewish leadership. Now, remember, Gentile leadership, by and large, was trained by Jewish leadership. Right? We know that. I told you last week, and I'm going to be down the road reading from that work. The Didache, or the writings of the 12 apostles to the Gentiles, was the first discipleship manual, if you will. And so the Gentiles needed to be trained in how to conduct a service. and how to see prophets, and how to anoint the sick, and how to have the Lord's table, and how to bring strangers into your house, how to treat leadership, and so forth and so on. So we know that. We know that the non-Jews were taught by Jewish leadership, and they evolved this manual, and it was fairly prevalent. You can read it. It's online for free. There's nothing mystical about it. You can read it there. So here is what happens, is that the resurrection, now, there's the legend of the phoenix that dies and comes back to life on a yearly basis, like Bacchus and other mythologies, indicating the renewal in the springtime. So that gradually was, in some, not all, in the beginning of the 2nd century, that was beginning to creep in as an explanation of the resurrection. Well, you can see how far removed that is from the resurrection of Israel and the resurrection of all creation. It's just a yearly cycle that people can identify with, right? So you've now diluted significantly, probably with good intentions. It was not with bad intentions, but you could see how, a dilution like that would diminish the need for a Jewish festival of Bikurim and Pesach, and be supplanted by something else, by the equinox, right? By something really big, but Greco-Roman in its cosmology. Something really big, right? So in this era, you have the evolution of a number of different folks, and we have to distinguish between them. The two groups that I'm thinking of specifically, and we mustn't confuse them, are the Ebionites and the Nazarenes. Now, I'm going to be talking about the Ebionites and the Nazarenes in the future when we get into the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. All of this history is stopped by the Arab conquest of the Middle East. So the Jewish segment of the believers, the non-Jewish segment of the believers, never had a chance to normalize, really. Primarily by a council that arose in the 4th century and the Arab conquest. So we'll get into it. We're not nowhere near that right now. Okay. So what happens is you get the Nazarenes, which are the real Jewish believers with sound doctrine. They believe in the sanctity of all of the Holy Scriptures. They believe in the teachings of Paul. They believe in the validity of the foundation of the Tanakh. They keep a Jewish tradition. They don't demand that everybody become Jewish, but they try to assimilate non-Jews into a Messianic Jewish, if you will, umbrella. These are the groups that have some difficulty with the Gentile majorities. The other group that you have are the Ebionites. So the Ebionites were really Gnostics. And they weren't a minimal group. They were very powerful and wrote a number of New Testamentish type books. That's where we get Yeshua and Mary marrying and producing the Holy Grail. Works like that. But the Ebionites' main book was Matthew. And they disregarded the works of Paul. They did not believe, they believed that Yeshua was the Messiah, but that he was not born of a virgin. And they felt, I'm so powerful that I hear myself. So, that's okay, it's okay. That's the only way he can hear. So, basically you have the Ebionites, and they don't believe that the body is that significant. They believe the spirit has everything. So they're party people. Their morality is less than what we would expect from a Jewish group. And so they get a bad reputation amongst the pagans who have converted to the new faith, and they look at the Ebionites and they say, this is how the Jews live? This is what they want to, because the Ebionites are a strong force. And so they confuse, maybe purposely, maybe not purposely, I don't know. I can only say that these two groups are confused time and time and time again. I just want to bring up one more thing and that is the Syrian community becomes a very powerful Jewish believing community, but it's influenced heavily by Gnosticism. So the Ebionites flourish there and produce works, and people go there because it can still be accepted by the greater Judaism from the perspective of not seeing Yeshua as divine, but just a prophet and the Messiah. Okay, fine and dandy, right? Where the Nazarenes can't be tolerated because they see Yeshua as divine, right? So what happens is a couple of things. One, Hadrian. Now we're talking 140-ish. Hadrian begins to levy taxes on the Jewish people. And so Christians are seen as a Jewish sect, even in 140. So he levies a Jewish tax on the Christians in Rome. And so the Bishop of Rome goes to Hadrian and says, look, I'll make a deal with you. We won't make any trouble for you. We won't really preach strongly against emperor worship, although we don't believe in it, but take away the tax. We're not them. Okay? So that's the first crack in the armor, right? More or less official crack in the armor, where we see really kind of a breaking away from Jewish rootedness, if you will. And Hadrian goes for the deal. Now, the other thing that is important is this Jewish believer Hegesippus arises on the scene, and he's a great scholar and a great clergyman and a prolific writer. And he produces a 5-volume history. I want you to know, we're talking about 140 CE. And in 140 CE, enough has happened with the Jewish believers and the believers in general. By the way, it's still a predominantly Jewish leadership. But he produces a 5-volume history of what is called, well, what later scholars would call the church, but the body of Messiah. I want you to think of that. That between the time of Yeshua, including the life of Yeshua, and 140, there was enough stuff that happened to produce 5 volumes of history. Mysteriously, they disappear. And all we have left is this little 1-volume Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. Okay? And it's not pro-Jewish, I can tell you that. Okay? So by the time the 4th century has turned, some things have happened. What could have happened that Eusebius, who is called Constantine's historian, by the way, okay, paid for by Constantine. And Constantine is seen in a certain way. I'll paint the picture later on. Okay, so what happens between 140, with Hadrian making that deal, Hegesippus coming forth, what happens that one, Eusebius uses Hegesippus's information to produce his own volume, but all of those all 5 volumes mysteriously disappear from the earth? I suspect that they still do exist somewhere, but that's yet to be found. Okay, so what happens? One of the things that happened is called, and this is fairly early on, in about 110, and continues in discussions in 155 and later, and it's called, have you ever heard of the Quarto-Deciman controversy? The Quarto-Deciman controversy, a big deal. And quarto in Latin, deciman, 10 plus 4 is 14. The 14th of Nisan controversy. What happens on the 14th of Nisan? It's Passover. Okay? So the death and resurrection of Yeshua was in all of the body of the Messiah celebrated on Passover. Okay? John and all his disciples, John had taught, we know this from the patristic fathers, John had taught his disciples to celebrate the death and resurrection of Yeshua on Passover. Okay? The Lord's Supper, for example, this is a big controversy today. I don't know where Messianic Jews get the idea that the Lord's Supper was celebrated on Passover once a year. It's total nonsense. Okay? And when you do this, and as often as you do this, and the Greek says that as often as you do this, and you do it often, like every time you get together, okay? All right, be that as it may. So this is not the Quarter Day Simon controversy is not the Lord's Supper controversy. And no one on either side is saying that the resurrection didn't happen. That wasn't part of the controversy. All right? Some refer to this as the Easter controversy, right? What is the point? The point is that in 155, you've got Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, and Anicetus, the bishop of Rome, on opposite sides of this issue. Now, it had already been an issue as early as 110. But even in 155, it was not popular among most of the congregations of the known world to dismiss the death and resurrection celebration on Passover. Most of them celebrated it on Passover. But now we're making an issue. And later in 195, we have Polycrates, the bishop of Ephesus, and Victor, the bishop of Rome, and they go at it again. And Victor of Rome is determined to stop this Jewish practice, right? Which he does for Rome, but still it's not that well accepted. All right. So what happens? Well, Polycarp, who supposedly was a disciple of John, said that John taught me that this has to be celebrated on Passover. It's the biblical festival. It's the historical reality. It has to do with the theme of coming out of Egypt, redemption, resurrection of the Jewish people, the resurrection of the world, all the things that I mentioned before, right? And you want to make it something different. You want a different day that is not in the biblical tradition, and that's just it. One, it's inappropriate because this has been passed down by an apostle, right? So why? Okay, so they go at it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Should we? And even Easter was not the time necessarily that they picked at that time, although it was an option. The question was, should it be celebrated on Passover, right, the 14th of Nisan, or should it be celebrated on the day that he resurrected on a Sunday? So it wasn't as complicated as we've made it. And there's logic on both sides. I mean, it could be the first, if it was the first Sunday of the month, we could say what? That Yeshua resurrected on a Sunday, except for the fact that was a Sadducean Bikurim, and the first fruits. And the first fruits holiday for the Pharisees, which was the majority of the disciples, was the first day after Passover, right? So there's a question about when to celebrate this. So clearly, yes.
So at that time, the debate about when it should be celebrated, later on this intensified. Would you say at that point that there were motivations to separate it from Jewish tradition? Even then?
Even then, yes. Yes, because you have Judaism. I loaned a book which I should have never loaned, and it was a rare book, which is one of my problems. It was a book on the Latin fathers, Greek and Latin fathers' writings, all of them on the Jews. Okay, every Latin father and Greek father that ever wrote anything about the Jewish people is in that book. Fortunately, I copied many pertinent pages out of that book. I'll just give you an example. By the way, that book explains the difference between the weak and the strong. Okay? I mean, it just clearly defines it. And it's not what you think. at all. We might get into that a little bit. But where was I going? Oh, yeah. So I think it was Cicero wrote that the reasons why the Jewish people do not eat pork is it's because it's their God. And the Roman community bought it. Okay, they bought it. Okay, it's absurd. But the Jewish people, by and large, not in every season, but by and large, were held in disdain. Okay, now there were seasons and there were certain authors that were very much pro-Jewish, but by and large, that's not what you get in those writings. Quickly, yeah. But Roman authors typically were anti-Semitic very early on. It's the reason why Hellenism sprang up so successfully amongst the Jewish people. It gained them an access. It gained them acceptability. Some Jews reversed circumcision, which was a ghastly operation, but they reversed the operation to gain access. And they were successful. The Hellenistic Jews were highly successful. Hellenism was a successful movement. So you have this controversy. When shall we do it? And so they argue back and forth and back and forth. Basically, you have one side saying it should be on a Sunday, some Sunday. I'm sure they had Ishtar in mind, but nobody said it, at least in these arguments. And then the other side, the Polycarp and his crew side, said, no, if we have a tradition of Passover and a meaning and a historical and biblical meaning, why dull that? Why blur that by bringing in something else? That was the argument. All right. All right. Yeah. So Polycarp's argument was not really scriptural as much as it was traditional and having meaning, right? Having historical meaning, eschatological meaning. So what happens is supposedly they didn't want this to escalate an argument. So in 155, Polycarp and his antagonists said, look, we'll have our differences of opinion, but let's depart in peace, which they did. And the congregations were split, most of them towards the 14th of Nisan, but were split in terms of when to practice the resurrection of Yeshua. Now along comes 188. 188 is a different story. I'm going to, 188, Victor of Rome is not like his predecessor. Victor of Rome is determined to make an edict. And he said if the biblical occurrence was on a Sunday, we must mandate it on a Sunday and would not give any quarter whatsoever. So for his congregation, which was substantial, you gotta remember that congregations needed money. Missionary events needed an inordinate amount of money. We think of these poor missionaries, in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century traveling, and it's true that it's not like they had a lot of money, but it took a tremendous amount of money to have a caravan or to have somebody supported in a foreign land. And so Rome was very important. That's why Paul wrote his letter, Romans. Theologians like to call that the book of grace, but really it was a deputation letter. You can see it. It's a deputation letter. Guys in Rome, listen, you don't tell the potter how to make you. If God has sent me, the Jew, to go to the West, you have to support me. It's not me making the request. It's God making the request on my behalf, right? So you give me the money to go west. I've completed my Eastern campaign. I'm going west. And he did, according to the patristic fathers. So basically you have Victor of Rome saying, that's it, 188, we're done. We are going to celebrate the resurrection on a Sunday, right? Which he migrated towards Easter. because that was already a holiday that everybody knew. He transformed it. And that's not unusual. Almost everything in Judaism that you see has been taken from paganism and reworked. Yeah. Yeah. The months of the year, all kinds of things, fasts and so forth and so on. Religions do that by and large. And so it's not outside of the tradition, even within Judaism, of transforming holidays. The question is, what do you do on those holidays, and how much do you incorporate, and have you lost the original meaning, which we would have to say yes. If the original meaning has been lost, for example, people worship on a Sunday. It's not the Sabbath, but it's their Sabbath. It means the same thing to them as it does to us, with a couple of very important differences. That God rested from the work of creation, right, on the Sabbath. So he reflects on the 6 days of creation. We reflect on our week. The Christian church doesn't teach that. It's just, it's a day of rest, a day of worship, which overlaps what we believe, but it doesn't do everything that it was intended to do. It certainly does. Sunday certainly doesn't represent the coming out of Egypt and the restoration of the world. So these are the things that, yeah. What's that? The argument was that it was a covenant with Israel, not with the church. That's okay? Yeah. So we'll examine all of that. We'll take a look at that. Of course, the Jewish believers didn't buy that. They said, you're coming into our faith. You're coming out of what you're into, and we're coming into our own faith. That's our own faith, right? So you're coming into our faith. We're not coming into your faith. Right? So there was that problem as well. Let's take a look. So are we clear on the quartodeciman thing? That's the beginning. That's just the beginning of things. It shows a real crack under Hadrian. It shows a real decision by the Bishop of Rome. By the way, by and large, the other congregations, even as late as 188, did not buy into this. They were still celebrating the death and resurrection of the Messiah on Passover. Okay, so it was not resolved until Constantine, and we're just not ready to go there yet. Okay, we've got to develop the literature of the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries. Okay, we can't just make it up. Okay, we're going to go to the prima facie literature that actually solidified the thinking of the day, and you're going to see it's actually a logical progression, right? And we're going to see that. So let's take a look at some of the scriptures that were controversial, really in the latter part of the 1st century, but certainly in the beginning of the 2nd century. And one of them is in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 3. Three main subjects, okay? The Torah, validity of the Torah, what does God mean by new? 16, verses 1 through 3. Now concerning the contribution for the saints, as I directed the congregations of Galatia, so you are also to do. So what are we talking about? Tithes and offerings, right? We're talking about monies that are gathered. On the first day of every week, each of you, what's the first day of every week? Huh? Let me ask you a question. What is the second day of the week called? Tuesday or Tuesday? No, it's called Monday. Okay. I get them every time. Did I get you? Yeah. Never. All right, so the first day of the week is Sunday. Okay. So the gathering of the monies is what we're talking about. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so the contributions need not be made when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Let me ask you a question. Why not do it on the Sabbath, when everybody congregates together? It was part of Jewish law everywhere in the world. That's not a day to gather money. So does that mean you can't put anything in the tzedakah box? Don't believe it. It has to do with many things, the laws of carrying and so forth and so on, which are rabbinic in nature. So yes, you can give. The point is that the gatherings are private, and somebody comes to your house on the first day of the week when you're what? Not in a worship service, right? It's not a holiday, and it's not a worship service. It's a work day. It's a part of the week, a regular part of the week, right? Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to look at the Greek here. So you are to gather, and the Greek here is by himself, privately. Nobody's going to know what you give. You're going to give it. I'm going to come by on a Sunday. That's when we're going to do this. All right. Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah. 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 But it was before anything started, right? Before she entered the temple grounds. Right? Okay, so Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Yeah. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, this is not breakfast. When are they on the first day of the week breaking bread? They're breaking bread on what's called Havdalah. Havdalah is after the temple worship is done, after you go home according to the Didache and you have your worship service, you break bread. Okay, you have a dinner. This is Saturday evening, right? Saturday evening, then it gets dark. You get 3 stars in the sky. You got what? First day of the week. Starts at sundown. When we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the following day. And he prolonged his speech into midnight. There were many lights in the upper chamber where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus was sitting in the window. He sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome with sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But when Paul went and bent over him and embracing him, he said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. They took the lad away alive, and they were not a little comforted. Upon the first day of the week, why does Paul travel on the first day? Why does Paul travel on Sunday? Sunday is a work day. Sunday's a travel day. You can go where you want. On the Sabbath day, you can't travel where you want because of the Erev, right? You can only travel so far. So everybody stayed together where they were, right? What were they doing? They were observing the Sabbath, not legalistically. It was just that was the lifestyle. That's what a Jewish sect that believed that the Messianic era had come, that believed in the Messianic person, Yeshua, that's what they would practice. That was normal for them to practice. There's no argument about it. There's no controversy. There is never a controversy in the book of Acts. And there's no controversy up to about 110 in the 2nd century either, right? And those controversies are few and far away from one another. Okay. So how about Revelation chapter 1, verse 10? I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. And then he goes into the, So the Lord's day has got to be Sunday, right? Sunday in the Scripture and in the 1st century and in the 2nd century is never called the Lord's day. It's never called the Lord's day, even in the 2nd century. What is the day, the Lord's day? The Greek can be translated the day of the Lord. I was in the Spirit on the day of the Lord. He's got a vision of the day of the Lord. Revelation is a vision of the day of the Lord. It's not Sunday. It's the day of the Lord. We see it over and over and over from the usage of the Greek text, the Septuagint. It's stated just like that. The day of the Lord is the exact same phraseology. The context of Revelation is what? The coming of Yeshua. The return of Yeshua. We're in a marriage contract with Yeshua. Don't break the contract. Don't bust up the ketubah. Stay for the wedding. That's the whole message. I don't care. You can translate whatever you want to translate. That's the whole message of the book of Revelation. You're engaged to the Messiah. Stay for the wedding. Don't look to another. End of story. Now, there's a lot of good things in there in between, obviously. Okay? If we ever study that again, which is likely down in the future, we'll point all of that out. Right? I'm writing to you, Revelation 1:19. Now, write what you see, what is and what is to take place hereafter. What does the day of the Lord look like? It looks like the book of Revelation. How long does the day of the Lord last? A long time. Right? A long time. The disciples thought it was when they were living. We know that unequivocally because of the Acts chapter 2. Peter says, we're living in the days of Joel. Right? The day of the Lord is a very long time. We like for it to be one event. And it culminates in him coming back, setting things straight. But the day of the Lord itself is a very, very long time. Okay? It's a kairos, event-driven time. It's not a chronos time. Here is our question, which I'm going to leave you hanging. If Sunday did not begin with the apostolic period, which clearly it did not, then when did it begin? Now, I'm using Sunday as an example, but it's Sunday, it's Easter, it's this, it's a lot of... Where and when did these practices come in, and for what reason? What was the point? Okay? Bob? You protest too much. Okay.
Can you ask that question again?
The apostolic period is the 1st century, essentially. Maybe if John lived to 90, maybe it spilled into the 2nd century. But if Sunday did not originate with the apostolic period, meaning the biblical period, when did it start? When do we have a Sunday? When does Sunday start becoming the Lord's Day? When are the practices that were particularly Jewish? And I'm talking generally now. I'm not talking about all of the quirks of the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Essenes. I'm talking about the things that people generally agree to, the festivals, the practices of kashrut, moral behavior, idolatry, immorality, those kinds of things. That's what kept Israel together. They all believe different things. If you read the Aggadah, the Aggadah material in Jewish writings are not binding. They're opinions. And most of the things spoken about the Messiah are Aggadah. They're Haggadic, not halakhic. They're not law. You don't have to believe them. You can or cannot. Messiah is this, Messiah is that, Messiah is the other. He's of the line of David, that's halakha, for sure. But, his name is this, his name is that, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. If it's not in the biblical text, it's Haggadic, right? So where did Sunday come in? Somewhere we've got to be able to look at a text and determine, which we can. Fortunately, we have a lot of texts. In my library, I've got Christian texts like this from the early centuries, right? Yep. Say it again. Well, there was no, during the time I'm talking about, there's no Roman Catholic Church. Most of these writings predate that. And you'll see that when I give you the dates. They predate 325. My friend, you are on the right track, but you're going to be a little shocked, I think, unless you know what I'm going to be teaching. You're going to be a little shocked at how Sunday became Sunday. Okay? It's a tragic thing, but, And again, we're not here to go to the churches and picket and saying you're going to hell because we're not bashing. We're just saying we know for sure how things progressed. Don't come back to us at Beth Messiah and condemn us for observing the Sabbath. That's all. We're doing what's in the tradition of the apostles and the apostolic period. That's what we want to do. Okay? We don't want to do everything in the book of Acts. We don't want to be a second century or an Acts chapter 2 congregation because it was crazy. Okay? You want to go back and reinvent the wheel? Right? All of the crazy stuff that you had to deal with, Gnosticism, nobody wants to go back to that. We have Paul's writings. Okay? Let's move forward. Let's start from where Yeshua ended. Okay? So that's where we are right now. We understand that there were the Quarter-day controversies, controversies of Jewish practice, controversies of Greek mythology, like the phoenix entering into becoming theology. The phoenix is becoming theology. That's where the danger lies. Because there's that theology, if theology even is possible, to study God, how do you do that? You can hear what he says and see what he does and believe that. But to study him personally, how do you do that? It's like, how do I study a star 14 trillion miles away? I don't. I can say a few things about it with redshifts and so forth and so on, but I can't go there and see it. I can't describe it really in detail. So that's where we are, and we'll pick up a little speed. I'm not going to dawdle that long, but you can see from those three scriptures that clearly they can be misinterpreted. The first day of the week can be Sunday, can't it? Havdalah can be missed if you don't know there's a Havdalah. The first day of the week will be Sunday during the day instead of Saturday during the night. You catch what I'm saying? So it can be misinterpreted, which I don't think, the closer you get to the first century, the less excuse you have. But I can see today, I'll never forget, I was in a congregation, I was speaking in a congregation, we were having Passover Seder, and the table asked me, I'm going to finish up here real soon. The table asked me about Sunday. And I explained it fairly thoroughly. And I just basically said a decision was made along the way for X, Y, and Z. that Sunday was the resurrection of Yeshua, so the Sabbath is going to be on Sunday from now on. And they said, well, that's not right, and that's not the Sabbath. It's when we worship. And then the rector comes along, and they ask him, how come we worship on Sunday? He said, because that was the resurrection of Jesus. So they're all looking at one another. He knows something's up, but I didn't mean to cause a division there or confusion and whatnot, but it is confusing when you study the history. So I'm not saying I'm not a super Jew. I'm not let's wear peyot and black coats and so forth and so on. I'm just saying that our practices in Beth Messiah are meaningful. They are meaningful biblically. They are meaningful historically, right? They have meaning in and of themselves. So our Shabbat, for example, the next holiday, Purim, all these things have meaning beyond the simple holiday because we are commanded to do it, right? They mean something. They are grounded in God's faithfulness. They are grounded in God's character. And when you add other things and say this is that, there's no historical or biblical grounding in it. And from my view anyway, you dilute the message so that the phoenix becomes what do they think of? Is Yeshua going to arise yearly? Are they going to eventually come to grips with Halloween? Do you know what Halloween produced? They couldn't get rid of Halloween, so they produced a counter holiday, All Hallows Eve. That's how you got All Hallows Eve. Right? Good, bad, or indifferent, it was a reaction to a pagan practice. Okay? Good, bad, or indifferent, however you view that. Right? But there is no basis in the Bible or in history for that holiday. You see? So somebody goes to services on All Hallows Eve and the kid asks, why are we doing this? And nobody even knows that it's a reaction against Halloween. What's that? Yeah. Okay. So that's the kind of thing I think we have to learn. Now, is it the main thing? No. Transformation into love, that's the main thing. But we've been preaching that now for years, and people get that. So I think it's some time now to include some of these other things that we have taught in the past, which people need to know, but they need to know it properly, not in church bashing, but to genuinely understand, why do we at Beth Messiah do things? Like everybody does this, right, when the Torah is lifted up. Why do you do that? Huh?
All my Hebrew students, come on.
You know why? No one in the world knows. I have at least a dozen explanations. My explanation is the smallest part of your body is agreeing with the writings of the Torah. I made it up.
And it sounds great.
I just made it up. Okay? Somebody else will say it looks like a yod. No, historically, rabbis have said this, it looks like a yod for yod hey vav hey. They made it up. Okay? But the tradition means something, right? But if I'm pressed on it, like some people press me, I have to say, why do you wear yarmulke? Where did the yarmulke begin? Nobody else knows either. There's three different explanations. They're all good explanations, but honestly, nobody knows. Okay? We do these things. Fundamentally, you're a function of my upbringing and my training. Okay? So you got to watch out. Okay? Theology goes that way too, how you were trained. You have to watch out. Does that make sense to you? Right? Now, of course, we're under God's authority. Yes, that makes a whole deal of sense. Can women wear them? If it means that we're under God's authority, the answer is yes. It's not a male status symbol. Right? So we have to do things that make sense, that are meaningful, giving our people some explanation. Otherwise, our kids, we're going to give them a bar mitzvah. You know how to get rid of the mice in the synagogue? You give them a bar mitzvah. Or a confirmation. You know that's true in the church and in the synagogue. You give them a confirmation, bye-bye. You give them a bar mitzvah, bye-bye. Because they're not grounded, they're not given explanation. Why do we do that? Well, if we do that for that reason, why should we? I don't want to do that. And we have to say, okay. Oh, Shabbat means this? I want to do that. Okay. Or this means that? Yeah. You said it in your sleep.
But that's what she got. No,
Okay.
I thought I was teaching her.
Anyway, look, if people get transformed, believe me, there'll be very few fights, very few divisions. If people are transformed into love, there's very, very little disagreement. And most things you'll find in Beth Messiah are not doctrine. Okay? You can have opinions. There are doctrines, virgin birth, that's a doctrine, right? Deity of Messiah, doctrine. But somebody wants to put on phylacteries, another person doesn't want to put on phylacteries. It's not doctrine. It's practice. You have to make a difference between those things. That's right. That's Derek's favorite. Deal breakers. There are some few deal breakers. The Scripture is the Word of God, deal breaker. All right, that's it for today. Yes.
So the going out of the Sabbath is Saturday night, and then is sunset is all day, or is it?
One day. One day is sunset to sunset.
Sunset. So Saturday going out of Sabbath.
That's tonight.
All
Tonight, when it gets dark tonight, it's Sunday.
right. Yeah. But the one about this, that one, Matzah Shabbat, whatever I would say that. I was just reading that in this Bible tonight. Literally, the going out of the Sabbath. Example: Saturday night. By biblical and Jewish reckoning, days begin at sunset. So where is it?
Because Genesis says, and the evening and the morning was day one.
Yeah, my only question is, so I know that the going out of the Sabbath was Saturday night. They met on Saturday night.
Right.
Saying,
It's the Havdalah. That's Havdalah.
okay, but that day, that whole stand there goes from sunset Saturday night over to sunset of the whole thing.
Sunday.
Day.
From Saturday night to Sunday night is Sunday in Jewish reckoning.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
And then
first
Sunday
day,
night
well,
would be
Sunday,
Monday.
well, first day.
Yeah.
We're mixing two things, that's why.
What did you say?
Jewish people in that day would have called it Sunday, they would call it the first day.
Yeah, Yom Rishon. Yeah, the first day.
Going out of what it would have been in our time, our thinking would have been
In our modern calendar, it would
Sunday, yeah, right. Okay.
Okay. All right. It's a study. It's questions. We ask questions here. Deborah. Any other questions or statements? Well, the prayer shawl originated in the four-cornered garment with the tassels on each end, or each corner. And what was the meaning of when you shall look upon them, you'll remember my law? Okay? It means that there were tassels on everybody's garments in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Canaan. Everybody wore tassels, but the tassels were of a certain color and length depending on your caste system. Okay? So you could tell, oh, he's a royalty. He's a governor. He's a judge. He's a lay person. He's a street sweeper. Okay? But Israel's tassels were all the same for the king, for the priest, for the layperson. They were all the same. So what it meant is there's no caste system. Everybody's to be treated the same way. So what happens is that four-cornered garment pretty much persists until the Middle Ages. And then in the Middle Ages, people aren't wearing four-cornered garments anymore, right? So what do you do with the tassels? There's no four corners. So at least in Eastern Europe, they invented the talit katan, the smaller talit, which was worn underneath, right, with four tassels. Now, in biblical times, that is, even in New Testament times, the prayer shawl proper was an extra piece of clothing separate from your four-cornered garment. And that was used in prayer. And some of the more pious people, or some of the people who wanted to be seen more pious, because there were both, had them sewn, improperly so, sewn onto their outer garment. So that they were wearing them all the time. I'm in a state of prayer, one of those kinds of things. And some were sincere and some were not. So the talit proper was actually something different and a much later event than the four-cornered garment with the tassels. Probably that was Second Temple. Usually, for the same reason that we hide our eyes playing peekaboo. No, it's to get alone with God without distraction. Yeah, that's why we cover our eyes. That's why we cover the head. And for some people that works, and for other people it's a distraction. But basically, I'm alone with God. This is my time with Him. I'm in community, but I don't want to be distracted with my prayer. Okay? We good? All right. Thank you, God, for your blessing, Lord, today. And Lord, we walk with you today. Thank you for your love towards us. And God, the goal of our instruction, the Scripture said that Paul said the goal of our instruction is love. So whatever is not of love can't be of you. And thank you for our history. Give us the love perspective of history as well. In Yeshua's name. All right, we'll see you next time. Next time will be Tuesday night prayer here. Wednesday night, 7 o'clock Bible study. And next week we'll be back here at 9:30 in the morning for our Torah study. God bless you guys.